Thank you for joining Ask for TR. I'm Benjamin Myers, and joining us today is Dan Haugen with the Adler School for Psychology. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ben.
Tell our audience a little bit about yourself. You're the president of the Adler School for Psychology, located in Richfield, Minnesota, correct?
Correct. It's the Adler Graduate School, and we are located in, as you said, Richfield, and we train about 400 to 500 students at any given time to enter careers as marriage counselors, school counselors, art therapists, a variety of different helping professionals. And that's something that I've been associated with for 32 years now.
So you have a history of dealing with mental illness or mental awareness, mental health issues, fair to say?
I do. Actually, before I became a full-time member of the Adler Graduate School staff in 2006, I had directed a nonprofit organization in the inner city of Minneapolis, a healthcare and social service agency, and we had a variety of programs under the banner of the Neighborhood Involvement Program. We had a rape and sexual abuse center, the second oldest in the country. We had a counseling center, another mental health program. We had programs for kids and seniors and clothing distribution. So we did a lot of things in the inner city. And so my background in working with the mental health field is really more like about 40 years old now.
So it sounds like you have a lot of experience when dealing with mental health issues.
I do, yes.
So now let me ask you this, turning your attention to some of the more recent incidents that have occurred in our nation's history as far back as, well, let's just look at 2012 up till now. It seems like there's a trend of incidents that have occurred where mental health seems to be at the core of the issue, but a lot of the times it's confused with gun violence or gun issues. What do you think about these incidents, for example, like Sandy Hook, the recent incident in Dallas, as well as the other incidents that happened in Orlando? When you look at those kinds of situations, your antennas have to come up as it relates to mental illness or mental health issues.
Exactly. Well, I'm going to say a little bit about the theory that I have about some of those behaviors.
Okay.
Some of those instances are explained in some ways by what's going on in contemporary culture. One very prominent theorist that most people have heard about is Sigmund Freud.
Okay.
And Freud used to talk about overly integrated people. In other words, people that were maybe too close to their family members and moms and dads, and they really didn't have much of a sense of what happened outside of their families.
Right.
His most obvious explanation for mental health issues was something that went wrong in the family. Today's culture tends to be more fragmentary in terms of how people are socialized.
What do you mean fragmentary?
Well, most people are aware that divorce rates are much higher, for example,
right.
and families are hard to define as to just what constitutes a family. It's not so much mom, dad, and two kids and a dog anymore. It's all variety of configurations. In fact, the traditional nuclear family probably is less than about 20% of families that are in our culture these days. And the fact is that, well, I believe it's a fact that there are kids coming out of those systems now that are just harder and harder to understand, and they're having a harder and harder time navigating their experiences.
Right.
There's a phenomenon that I think psychology talks about now that's more the disintegrated individual, the person that doesn't have the same connections to close, loving family members that perhaps was once the case. And again, in Freud's time, maybe it was an over-integration and an insular sort of experience, but now kids have almost an experience that has too many influences, and it takes a lot longer to put things together. The people that you're referring to, or at least that you were alluding to, with Sandy Hook and
right.
and the instances of violence recently in places like Orlando and Dallas, these were in all cases men that were described more than anything else as loners and not particularly
right.
connected to anybody.
Well, I thought it was really interesting, especially when looking at Sandy Hook, which is in 2012. When you look at that particular situation, you look at his family, and I love your phrase earlier, the disintegration of a family.
Mm-hmm.
You look at his family, his parents were divorced.
Yeah.
He lived with his mom. He was 20 years old when that incident occurred. But you look at the fact that his dad's not involved. I mean, dad is paying an enormous amount of child support. There's very little contact between him and his father, but you see this overly presence of his mother in him to the point where mom is taking him out shooting guns and has this additional emphasis on his life that revolves around this unifying idea of guns, which he later takes and kills a number of young people. 27 plus people over at the elementary school. I guess what concerns me, or what's interesting to me in looking at all three of these incidents, all of them are under 29 years old. All of them have some type of familial history that shows not necessarily a clear mental instability, but there's those hints of whether it was Mr. Lanza at Sandy Hook, who was clearly mentally disturbed. I mean, there was numerous documents that talked about his mental prowess or his mental illness. But then you look at the gentleman, Mr. Johnson, out of Dallas, where there's one singular allegation of something that happened in the military, but it seems like all of these people gravitate towards a violent outcome. You got the gentleman out of Orlando, Mr. Mateen. All of them have this violent ideology or this violent past that seems to come up, and that's their ultimate demise. So I guess my thought is there any way that we could have seen this coming? Is there any way that we can prevent it? Is there anything that we can do going forward? Anything we can take away from these? And there's a ton of additional incidents that have occurred in this country's history. But is there anything we can take from these three incidents moving forward that could help us with prevention?
Well, that's a $64,000 question, man. That is the essential question. The fact is that in the course of my career, I've always been told, it's always been communicated to me that violence is a very, very difficult thing to predict.
Right.
And in fact, this is going to sound kind of humorous. When I was first trained back in the early 70s, the notion was that one way to predict violence was to determine whether or not a child had wet the bed, started fires, or been cruel to animals. And those were perceived to be hallmarks of the person who ultimately became, in the language of the day, sociopathic.
Right.
In the language of today, antisocial. The difficulty in predicting violence is still with us today. It's not something that we do a lot better with, although I'm an optimist when it comes to those kinds of things. I think that there are ways in which, on a primary prevention level, you can see things and catch them early enough that it's more likely that you can intervene and bring some services to bear or supports to bear, even if it's not formal services, that make a difference.
Let me ask you this. Looking at these three incidents, do you see anything in Mr. Lanza's history with Sandy Hook that would have set off alarms for people to say, hey, this is a kid who we need to keep guns as far away from as possible?
I believe that Mr. Lanza, as a 20-year-old, had already displayed a great deal of isolationist kinds of behavior. I think that he was described as spending most of his time in solitary activity down in his basement. Kind of classic. And I'm not suggesting that his mom didn't try to intervene and do something about that, but there are certainly those possibilities that some of that behavior could have been taken as a reason for action early on, because I'm under the impression that it dated back to his adolescence at least, and he was only a 20-year-old at the time.
Right. You know, I look at him, and from my perspective, knowing his background, I think he was even diagnosed with Asperger's or some other type of acute illness. You know, looking at that and then introducing weapons to that particular individual, to me seems it's almost foretelling. It's like you should have known once you started giving this kid the ability to play video games that depicts extraordinarily high levels of violence, and then adding to that real live guns, it seems like it's nothing less than a recipe for disaster.
I agree, and again, I certainly don't want to besmirch the mom's reputation since she's deceased, but the fact is that when they did a search of the house after the events in the Sandy Hook community, it was, I think, determined that he had 1,400 rounds of ammunition.
So
that had not been used.
It was a lot, right? It was a lot. So you look at cases like that, and you can't help but say mom and dad, or mom or whoever the primary care provider was, should have said, okay, I probably should not introduce this into his environment. But nevertheless, she did, and this is the outcome that you get. But then I think a lot of people would say, well, this kid was 20 years old. He enjoys the Second Amendment. He enjoys the right to bear arms. He enjoys that. So why would we criticize mom? Why would we take away his right to have a firearm when it's everyone's right, unless you're adjudicated or unless there's some other process to otherwise say you can't have one, which is essentially don't, if you commit a qualifying offense or a felony, or you're engaged in domestic violence or any of those qualifying issues, we should still allow them to enjoy the Second Amendment. How do you look at Mr. Lanza and his situation, knowing that he has this propensity and knowing that he has a right to bear arms? How do you tell him, no, you can't have a gun? How do we tell people in society, well, yeah, you enjoy the Second Amendment right, but there's limitations to that, and you can't be X, Y, and Z, or in this case, you can't have these type of mental health issues. How do we deal with that?
Well, I think that it's been attempted, saying that and setting those limits has been attempted by smarter people than me, and I don't think that we've found the solution to that equation just yet. But I will say that it's my opinion that we are very, very quick to take these instances and turn them into referendums on guns. And of course, the various ends of the continuum come out in force. And I think we ultimately fail to recognize these situations for perhaps what they primarily are, and that's issues of mental health, issues of racial stereotyping. And I think that there's ways in which both of those things enter in to a degree, and perhaps more now than has been the case, which is a good thing, that we're looking at how we can prevent mental health problems from manifesting themselves in violence. And we're looking at ways in which racial and ethnic stereotyping manifest themselves sooner or later. People say enough's enough in violent behavior, but the gun part of it, to me, is an ancillary part of it. I have my own points of view, which are fairly conservative points of view relative to how those kinds of rights should be limited.
Right.
I guess that would be more of a liberal point of view. But the fact is,
you're pro-gun, anti-regulation is what I'm kind of hearing.
No. Actually, I'm just the opposite. Okay. So I should not have used the word conservative in that context. So
anti-gun, pro-regulation.
I not so much anti-gun, but definitely pro-regulation. Okay. And I do think there are important issues to take a look at relative to not only who has access, but access to what kinds of guns. In fact, I'd probably be more concerned about that part of the equation, access to what kinds of are mature and what kinds of ammunition are acceptable, than I would be to guns in general. But yeah, I think I have opinions about that just like everybody else, and probably strong opinions. But I do think that as a mental health professional, there's a whole lot of things that we can do on a preventive level that people are starting to do more of. For example, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which has probably one of the most active and best chapters in the country right here in Minnesota, are doing phenomenal jobs in their various communities in looking at some of the prevention-oriented interventions that could possibly come out of these tragedies.
And when we return with Dr. Haugen, we'll be discussing options on how to prevent future mental health related tragedies.
For the record, proof to show the truth.
And we're back with Dr. Dan Haugen with the Adler School for Psychology. Dr. Haugen, looking at issues of prevention, what, if anything, has been done in the arena of trying to prevent these type of incidents?
Well, Ben, one of the things that happens whenever there's a tragedy of the magnitude that we've experienced recently, and of course there are many more tragedies that preceded that, but the media descends on the persons who were carrying out the acts, and then we believe that we fully understand who they are in retrospect, and we wonder what could have been done and who should have done what. And the fact is, as I said a little earlier, it's very difficult to predict violence. That said, one of the, if you might refer to it as positive outcomes of these events of recent history is that we start to take a closer look at what could conceivably be done on a preventive level. And there are three different types of prevention. There's primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention, of course, is trying to catch things before they occur.
Now, is that looking more towards the immediate situation prior to the incident, or is that looking more towards something else, like maybe from an earlier childhood?
Well, it's really in some ways one and the same. Primary prevention is at best catching things before they occur at all, but also catching things as they're occurring at a low level of intensity. For example, if you are looking at some of the behavior in retrospect of Mr. Lanza, you might say that the behavior that he was displaying, the isolationist behavior in his own basement, dating from an early age, apparently, might have been behavior that was called attention to professionally if we had all the resources to bring to bear that community presumably had. I'm thinking it was a fairly sophisticated community and probably had a fairly elaborate mental health system, and if that system could have been brought to bear, perhaps Mr. Lanza's path would have been different.
So now, what kind of resources do you think that they could have brought to bear in attempting to prevent this type of incident that happened in Sandy Hook?
Okay. Well, if you look at some of the things that are going on now with regard to children's mental health, you'll see that there are many more services being co-located in schools than used to be the case. It used to be that mental health resources were pretty much forbidden in K-12 environments because there was perceived to be a lot of liability associated with that. There were certainly confidentiality questions that were raised, but now what you're seeing are lots of schools, and Minnesota is a good example, developing clinics for kids that they can use during the day and sometimes even involve other family members. So it's a holistic approach to working with kids in their educational environments. And we think that probably constitutes a very good prevention-oriented intervention. We also see that teachers are being trained through their continuing education obligations to detect kids' mental health issues at earlier stages. So in many ways, teachers and school counselors and other school personnel have been deputized to look for those kinds of things. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on teachers who are already doing a lot.
A lot, right.
But it is another set of eyes and ears to train on the children, again, at early ages, and hopefully prior to certain behaviors being manifest, especially manifest in violent sorts of ways. You'll also see the development of more comprehensive community clinics, and there are federal grants and other kinds of grants available to put together more and more of what might be considered again very comprehensive sets of resources for mental health services. It used to be that our country as a whole, and particularly states that matched the federal funds, had very, very fully developed continuums of care when it came to mental health. Those things have probably eroded over about the last 40 years, where when they were in their heyday was probably in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. But between the 80s and now, some of those resources have lost some of their funding steam and are shadows of what they once were, so that the continuum of care isn't quite what it was. And I think, again, although it may seem a morbid statement, that some of the recent events have refocused us on building back that continuum of care. And so some of those things, again, that are happening with kids at early ages, we hope will constitute opportunities for early detection and prevention.
Well, let me ask you this, kind of going back to what you mentioned a minute ago as it relates to teachers and them being kind of on the front lines and trying to detect these issues. You made a comment about the fact that teachers are already taxed well beyond their levels. But teachers are around our kids 8 to 12 hours a day. I mean, they are just as involved in their life as their parents are, as their parents should be. So with all the constraints that we see on teachers, all the constraints that we see on even parents being able to discipline their kids, now we're introducing this brand new conversation of mental health. And a lot of people, whether you're, to the left or the right of the socioeconomic scale, a lot of people look at mental health not as a positive resource, but more of a vilification or more of a demonization of their kid. Well, my kid is, he's not crazy. He doesn't need any help. He just needs to be left alone. So I don't see anyway, kids or parents gravitating towards mental health resources. What I do see is the state, especially in Minnesota, I see the state of Minnesota kind of forcing mental health resources on people that are only doing it because they're either court-ordered required to, or through the Child in Need of Protective Services process are required to do so. I don't see a lot of voluntary or voluntary submission of kids to the mental health environment so that we can detect them, whether it's from the school, a direct teacher on student perspective, or whether it's from an actual mental health professional who's saying, I see a concern in this kid, and as a result, we need to put him here, or we need to do whatever, X, Y, Z for this kid to make sure that he is given all the resources that he needs in order to be a positive and active member of our citizenry.
Yeah, you raise a really interesting challenge, Ben. The fact is that that challenge is not going to go away in the near future, but you're talking about, in many ways, the destigmatization of the mental health system, the demystification of the mental health system, because frankly, the mental health system has not been a positive resource in certain communities, whether they're communities based on race or ethnicity, or communities based on sexual orientation. You've certainly seen at times the mental health field descending on people, to use your word, as opposed to helping them ascend and work out things that are going on in their lives. One of the things that I referred to a little earlier in our conversation was an organization called NAMI, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And
tell me about what they're doing at this point in time.
Sure. I said a little bit about what an organization like NAMI is doing to champion activities in schools. I mentioned things that might have an effect on early detection and deputizing teachers, et cetera, but they're working in a lot of other domains too, as are other mental health advocates. But NAMI tends to put out summaries all the time for area professionals as to what's going on, so that we can jump on board and help too. For example, they're doing a great deal with keeping people informed about the children's mental health system, the adult mental health system, the correctional system, what's going on in those systems that could hopefully help to catch things before they erupt in violence, to catch things in some ways on a secondary level with regard to persons in the penal system.
Let me ask you this: what are they doing in detail, like specifically? Because I know dealing in the corrections department, or when you deal with prisoners or people that have been convicted of crimes, whether they be violent or nonviolent, they've already committed a crime, so they're already
Yeah.
on kind of a grid, so to speak. But when you start dealing with the teacher environment or people who don't have that type of history, what is NAMI doing as it relates to them?
Well, I'll mention kids again because they represent a good example of some of the things that are doing on this early prevention level. There's a movement in K-12 education now to find different ways to call attention to kids' behavior.
Okay.
Some of it might be referred to as positive discipline. For example, if a kid misbehaves or somehow steps out of line in grade school or middle school or high school now, they may be punished, so to speak, by having to put in some community service as a tutor with a younger child, as opposed to being suspended. Some systems, for example, have adopted a no suspension rule. Now, that positive discipline concept is a concept that's actually taken some root, gathered momentum in our culture generally, but certainly in our field, and looking at new ways of looking at behavior. There's also ways of rewarding behavior that are probably called attention to now in ways that they hadn't been before. A lot of times kids have been rewarded in very traditional ways with athletics, et cetera, but that doesn't necessarily touch more than about 25% of the kids in any school. Looking at positive things that kids do that had formerly not been called attention to is something that's gathered momentum. So there are ways in which we're looking at behavior differently and responding to behavior differently. But I want to just say too that the advocates in the mental health field are looking at a variety of other domains too. For example, homelessness, and looking at housing as a way of working with mental illness and preventing certain kinds of behaviors that certainly we have seen too many of lately. Working as more of an advocate for the homeless and people that have had disrupted sorts of living circumstances, whether there's homelessness or not. If you look at the employment world, there are things going on in the employment world now with regard to advocacy around opportunity and all the institutionalized sorts of impediments to employment that certain groups have faced. That's a mental health intervention in many ways. If you look at some of these interventions holistically, you start to easily understand them as having an effect on mental health. I'll give you a couple of other ones.
But before you give me any more examples, it sounds like prevention is critical and absolutely necessary. And with that being said, we'll be right back with Dr. Dan Haugen with the Adler School for Psychology to continue to discuss issues of prevention when it comes to dealing with tragedies that have occurred in this country.
For the record, proof to show the truth.
And we're back with Dr. Dan Haugen with the Adler School for Psychology. During this last segment, we talked about preventative measures to hopefully avoid recent instances of tragedy that's occurred in this country. One area that we're talking about now is the area of domains, that being school, work, and things of that nature. And Dr. Haugen, I think it's intriguing that there are 6 domains that we're talking about, that if we strategically target each one of those, that may be a way to prevent future tragedies that we've seen in the past. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and you could probably expand on the number 6 too, but what we've talked about so far, we've said a little bit about the mental health system, which of course is a natural place to look for prevention opportunities. We've said just a little bit about the world of employment and the workforce and what we could do perhaps to prevent certain mental health problems or certainly manifestations of violence because of what we do in that domain. We talked a little bit about the issue of housing and homelessness too, and some of the things that have been institutionalized as getting in the way of people's well-being and producing violence probably in those settings.
So let's look specifically at housing. What can NAMI do when looking at preventative measures or preventative care from the domain of housing?
Well, and again, NAMI is a advocacy group that calls attention to things and advocates legislatively, et cetera, et cetera. So they're not necessarily providing specific direct services, but they're calling attention to realities, which are that people have been disrupted in their living situations because of certain discriminatory practices, perhaps.
Right.
They've been disrupted in their living situations because of mental health problems getting in the way of gainful employment and all the things that might be necessary to sustain a household. I happen to do some work in a housing shelter, in a homeless shelter, and I know just in serving those persons on an occasional basis that many of them are experiencing mental health issues that are of some standing, and those things have tended to get in the way of people and their living situations. And so calling attention to that is just another domain of prevention-oriented behavior. I could mention a few others too that are I think distinctive. We at the Adler Graduate School, for example, are trying to do some things to expand the mental health workforce. It may not seem like it's a part of addressing mental health issues, but the fact is, we look at parts of our state and see a tremendous shortage of mental health professionals. We see it not only in urban areas in certain communities,
Right.
but we see it in rural areas where sometimes there isn't a therapist for 200 miles. So we are trying to do things to bring educational resources to those areas and hopefully affect the mental health of people living in those areas to the extent that they have greater access to services. And we're getting some help with that because the federal government, for example, has established under Obama's administration loan forgiveness programs.
For education for potential counselors in the future.
Exactly.
Okay.
If you are able to work in a nonprofit environment, for example, for 10 years, that is to say you have 120 or 12 months each year of evidence that you've been paying your loan,
Right.
then the rest of it will be forgiven if you have dedicated yourself to that kind of work environment. Now, it doesn't even have to be a rural nonprofit organization. It could be an urban nonprofit organization, but that's another thing that we hope will put a dent in some of the mental illness that our country experiences, and hopefully add positively to the overall experience, and even more importantly, to avoidance of certain kinds of tragedies like we've experienced. If you look at
Well, let me ask you this. Let me roll back just a little bit.
Okay.
Looking at trying to deploy these type of resources, because what it sounds like you're saying is that the resources that we're talking about is actual therapists who can go out into the field, meet with people who may be suffering from some type of mental health issue or a family member who suffers from a mental health issue, and deploy certain skills and say, hey, listen, this is what we can do to help you live a better life. What are we doing to reach out to minority groups or even people with different sexual orientations? What are we doing to hit those particular groups of individuals?
I'm going to give you an example at my own school, again, the Adler Graduate School. We have embarked on what we're referring to as a diversity initiative.
Okay.
And we can do better. There's no question that we can do way better than what we're doing right now. But what we've tried to do is train an increasingly diverse student body for service to an increasingly diverse community. And that's the mantra that we've been chanting for years now, training an increasingly diverse student body for service to an increasingly diverse community. Now, why would we do that? Well, number one, we take the attitude as a school that there aren't nearly enough persons in the mental health field right now as professionals
Right.
who are representative of different communities that constitute diversity. We think that there's a benefit to having some person that you can relate to more easily
Right.
sitting in front of you providing a service to you. That's not always the case.
Sure.
But the fact is we do have evidence to believe in the research that's been done in different communities that there's a uncertainty about embarking into the traditional mental health world. The fact is that we have not done a very good job as a field of serving the whole community. Graduate schools have not done a very good job of training people to serve the whole community. And so what we're trying to do is have a greater diversity of people, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, conservative, liberal,
Right.
sexual orientation at the table, training together, and hopefully a lot of good things will rub off on others in that training too. But we do believe that as an institution, that's our obligation. And in fact, we think creating access is about creating some of that diversity.
Now, let me ask you this. With that being said, and looking with that focus being in your mind's eye, looking at the situation that happened down in Orlando, we have this Mr. Mateen who apparently had some issue, whether it was with his own sexual orientation or his background of Islam. When you look at situations like that, when you see that it's not just a racial issue or a religious issue or a sexual orientation issue, it's almost all three, if not more.
Mm-hmm.
If we deploy these type of preventative measures, how would we have gotten to him in time to avoid the incident that happened in Orlando?
That is a question that we've been certainly struggling with before and since the Orlando incident. But you're right. In many ways, he was or may have been dealing with three separate but integrated phenomenon.
Right.
There was some question raised anyway about his own orientation,
Sexual orientation,
sexually, affectionally, the relationship that he was in, the marriage that he was in, I think was ended after about 4 months. He actually took action himself to end it, and we don't know exactly why.
Right.
His wife, in retrospect, believes that he was mentally ill, or at least she referred to his behavior as bipolar. And I don't know exactly whether she was using that in a professional sense or a
just an abstract,
popular vernacular sense.
Right.
But she perceived that he was dealing with some things. And then you factor in that as an Islamic person, he probably was subject to all kinds of bias because of that, because of the pigment of his skin. He probably was subject to other kinds of bias beyond just being Islamic. And so there was three things stacking up. And I don't know that his wife necessarily could have been a part of the prevention equation, but she apparently was being abused. Mm-hmm. And it's possible that there was some domestic behavior that authorities may or may not have been aware of. I'm not sure. What obviously happens in our culture is that people are given the benefit of the doubt, so to speak, when or at least many people in the culture are given the benefit of the doubt. I understand there are clear exceptions to who gets the benefit of the doubt, who doesn't. But we tend to err on the side of protecting people's degrees of freedom until such time as we can't avoid disrupting their degrees of freedom.
Until it impinges on other people's freedoms.
Until it becomes a real impingement. In fact, there are certainly times in all of our careers, especially if we're serving people, where we are told it's probably got to get a little bit worse before we can intervene as law enforcement officials or some other first responder.
It almost seems like if we were able to see the beginning, that we would have been able to prevent what happened later. I was just doing a little bit of research on Mr. Mateen before we met, and it looks like he had an issue with, a number of issues, whether it was from a religious background or a sexual orientation background, but he had a number of indicators that I think if people were paying attention, there would have, I don't want to say that it would have prevented Orlando, but I think it would have definitely put people more on alert to his propensity if we had paid attention. But I think it takes more than simply one person or a teacher or a principal or a mentor. I think it takes everybody. And unfortunately, what I see now in society is that we put a lot, like you said earlier during one of our previous segments, we put a lot on our teachers, We also put a lot on police. But for some odd reason, we seem to be divesting parents of their responsibilities. And so I'm trying to figure out what can we do so that we don't, and I think, again, we talked about this earlier too, what can we do to destigmatize the idea of mental health so that we can get in there earlier to prevent tragedies like what we've seen in the past?
Well, I don't mean to keep on calling attention to my my organization, but it is true.
Feels free.
It is true that the Adler Grad School honestly tries to look out its window as it concerns the various products that we might be offering and try to take a look at what the community needs.
Right.
And if we can see something that we think the community needs and then figure out a way to tap that appetite,
right,
we think we've got a win-win situation. I'll tell you one of the things that we're doing right now in that context. We are reintroducing parent training into our curriculum. It's been out of our curriculum for a while. Sometimes it's very hard to take all the things that students need to know and deal with them through the precious credit counts that we have to work with. But we definitely want to put parenting back into our curriculum.
Now, when you say parenting back into the curriculum, what specifically are you referring to?
We are actually putting into the curriculum a 12-hour segment where our students taking that particular course will be able then to train people into parenting interventions. For example, if we were to take one of the students in this course and put them in a nonprofit organization, they would then be able to train other people to work more actively with parents and help parents.
So is it training other people to work with parents, or is it actually training parents to be better parents?
It's really both. It's training the trainers who can then spread the word almost evangelically, you might say, with parents and helping those parents on the ground. Right. And what we think will ultimately happen then is that we can take this particular skill set that we're redeveloping, inserting into the curriculum, and maybe even take it into corporations and schools and different kinds of domains that could carry a price tag, maybe would be pro bono. But the fact is, we like to think that our origins in Adlerian psychology were in parenting, early childhood development, and healthy family life, and that we can begin to contribute that in the community. And so we're trying to do more of that. Certainly the kind of continuing education that we're considering, that I've actually talked with somebody about recently in an early childhood and family education domain, maybe could find us doing more work with teachers on how to work with parents. Teachers have 125 hours of continuing education obligations every 5 years. 25 of those 125 hours have to be in the area of mental health. And we're trying to figure out ways that we can, again, see what the community needs, see if there's an appetite in the K-12 or ECFE worlds for learning a little bit more from us as to how to work with parents as teachers. And that kind of a skill set, again, with a teacher deputized to watch for what's going on with their kids, might be a real asset in connecting the dots between kids and parents and helping the parents know what to do.
One thing I loved about Adlerian psychology is that it seems like the idea behind this particular psychology is you front load kids, you front load our society with the best that you have, the best therapists, the best education, with the idea that if you give them the best, they will be the best citizen. But it seems like we've gotten that wrong. It seems like with the actual practicality of it is that we backload everything. We don't take care of our teachers firsthand. We take care of them after the fact, but we take care of people that kind of have ended the race. Our politicians, they're the ones making, six figures, whereas our teachers are barely making $50,000 a year, but they're expected to watch our kids, to make sure that these kids don't turn out like Mr. Mateen and Mr. Lanza and others. We expect a lot from them, but yet we don't give them the resources to do that. And I'm wondering if there's not some form of legislation out there that could assist in doing exactly what Adler thought or what was thinking about doing, which is front-loading our educational system so that we can avoid tragedies that we've seen.
Mm-hmm. Well, Adler was part of something called the Child Guidance Movement. In fact, he was responsible for starting, I think, upwards of 30 child guidance clinics in Austria and,
right.
and really Nazi influenced parts of the world back in the 30s and actually had to close those when the Nazi regime took more effect. But the fact is that has been a consistent part of what Adlerian psychology has been predicated on, and not surprising then that we would be trying to do more with schools, not only in ways that might find us contributing to their continuing education obligations, but we actually think that we could do some things through a speakers bureau.
Right.
And just say in general to systems around the Twin Cities, if there's something that you need, an intellectual resource that you need, a particular type of presenter or presentation that you might need in the moment, we would like to be a go-to place for that kind of need, and it doesn't have to carry a price tag.
Right. And it sounds like prevention is the key to avoiding tragedies that we've seen. And I think this is an ongoing conversation and dialogue that needs to occur, because I don't think you can solve this in 45 minutes or an hour worth of conversation, but there needs to be more meat put to the idea. And I think Adler especially is doing a great job. You have some wonderful counselors and wonderful professors there that are trying to do exactly what you're talking about doing, which is add more to society so that we understand that helping each other is a lot better than trying to divide each other, which we see a lot more of.
Well, and I think that this is happening systemically. I call attention to my school, Ben, because it's right there every day in front of my eyes. But right. I want to give a lot of credit to some of the momentum that is emerging under a lot of other people's steam too. For example, I mean the Minnesota legislature has been doing things session in and session out to hopefully listen to groups like NAMI and take seriously some of the suggestions that are being made. One of the things that's going on right now is that if you know that concept of duty to warn, right. Certainly there are professional groups that have this obligation to protect right. And to make sure that they understand and respect their mandated reporter status. But one of the things that's going on right now is this duty to protect obligation has been expanded to interns and interns in a variety of different professional disciplines. I mean, not just full-fledged doctors, not right. full-fledged psychologists, but the people training in those domains have the same sorts of obligations, or beginning to have the same sorts of obligations to warn when they see things emerging, like maybe early evidence of Mr. Lanza's ultimate behavior,
sure.
Or Mr. Mateen's ultimate behavior. That I think is helpful. It may feel like it pinches a little bit in the moment, and I guess there's probably going to be some false positives along the way where people have somebody's warned someone about them, and it doesn't manifest itself in behavior that really needs to be intervened on. But really, that's the point.
Right.
Is intervening before
it happens. Right.
Manifests itself.
Right.
So I think it would be nice to take credit as an institution for the things that we're doing, but the fact is this whole set of circumstances that's emerged over time and the tragedies that seem like they occur on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis, has got a lot of people motivated and mobilized. And I'm really glad for that, because it's cutting across domains and going beyond just the mental health field.
Right. And we'll be right back with Dan Haugen with the Adler School for Psychology. And we're back with Dr. Dan Haugen with the Adler School for Psychology. Doctor, I wanted to thank you for coming out and giving us so much valuable information, especially in dealing with prevention. Now, there are a couple websites that you want to throw out for NAMI as well as some other organizations. So what organizations would you like to mention?
Sure. I'll give you the website for my school, the Adler Graduate School. It's www.alfredadler.edu. It's alfredadler.edu. And I also want to give you the website for this organization that I referred to as an advocacy group, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And their website is and I'm going to have to look, www.namihelps.org. That's NAMI helps, HELPS.org.
Well, again, thank you for coming out. This has been not only informative for me, but also hopefully extremely informative for our audience.
Well, if I might also add, Ben, it's been really nice having this conversation with you. We've had other conversations privately, and this is just an extension of that, and it's been my pleasure to be here. Thank you for being so gracious and graceful.
No, thank you. Yeah. And that wraps it up for us today at Ask for TR, the CBN edition. I'm Ben Myers, and for the record, you're not alone.
For the record, proof to show the truth.